So this week, we're going to be continuing in the great fun of regulations. And yeah, so we're going to start off with FAR 91-151. So no person may begin a flight in an airplane under VFR conditions unless, considering wind and forecast weather conditions, there is enough fuel to fly to the first point of intended landing, and assuming normal cruise speed, during the day to fly at least 30 minutes after, or at night to fly at least 45 minutes after. Main takeaway here is you need to have enough fuel to get to your destination. And during the day, you have to be able to fly for at least 30 minutes after that, and at night, at least 45 minutes after that. Now, if you go out and do flight training, some flight schools up this number. Some flight schools, my flight school in particular, we required an hour of extra fuel. But the minimum requirement is that you have at least 30 minutes on board during the day and at least 45 minutes on board at night. And most small aircraft are fine. Most small aircraft can fly for 4 or 5 hours with full tanks. So it's not a huge deal, but you just need to make sure that you plan that in.
What if your destination is the airport you're taking off from?
Well, then you need to have at least 30 minutes of gas, I suppose. However, it's likely if you're just doing there could be two scenarios there, I guess. Like one where you're going out and you're just doing like laps around the pattern, and then another one where you go out but you don't actually land anywhere and return. Which, I guess in that case, you just plan out your flight and add 30 minutes, I think. But yes, that applies to your same landing airport as well.
Seems reasonable.
Yeah. Most of the rules, I guess, are there to keep you safe or something like that. Not quite sure. Anyway, so yeah. All right. So this regulation does not look like this in the FARs. This is what is known in aviation circles as the airspace triangle. The actual regulation, if you looked up FAR 91-155, would be a bunch of text about what visibility requirements were for flying VFR in the different types of airspace. I figured that was not worth reading, and in fact, probably is harder to remember. So instead, we have this fancy graphic, which is known as the airspace triangle, which lists out VFR visibility and cloud clearance requirements for flying in certain airspaces. So like we talked about last time, this chart has all the different types of airspace, except for Class A airspace, which is IFR, so you can't fly VFR in there anyway. So we have Class B, C, D, E, and G. I'm not sure if I talked about this last time, but in the United States, there is no Class F airspace. They skipped over that. So you just get B, C, D, E, G. Yeah, so fun stuff. So basically, I'm going to give you a mnemonic after we look at these slides. So don't think you just have to memorize this. There is a way to remember these. Maybe it's helpful, maybe it's not, but we'll see. Anyway, so we'll just start at the top. So you have this separation line, which is 10,000 feet. So this little box on the right that says 10,000 feet, mean sea level, is indicating that level. So Class E and Class G below 10,000 feet have different requirements than Class E and Class G below 10,000 feet. So above 10,000 feet, Class E and Class G are required to have 5 statute miles of visibility, 1,000 feet above clouds, 1,000 feet below clouds, and a statute mile horizontally from clouds, which seems like a lot, but it is kind of reasonable. So below 10,000 feet, Class G is further split into two categories. So you have Class G at night and you have Class G during the day. So Class G during the day, below 10,000 feet, you're required only to have statute mile clear of clouds. So what that means, you're required to have statute mile visibility, and you're just required to make sure you don't go into a cloud. So there's no actual distance you're needed to be apart from them. You just need a statute mile visibility. And if you have a statute mile visibility, I'm going to also assume that you're probably not in a cloud, but maybe that's not the case. And then Class G at night has a little bit stricter requirements. So they require you to have at least 3 statute miles of visibility, 1,000 feet above, 500 feet below, 2,000 feet horizontally. And this Class G at night also applies, the same requirements apply to Class C, D, and E, which, if we remember from last time, are all controlled airspaces. So inside of Class C, D, and E, you're required to have the same 3 statute miles of visibility, 1,000 feet above clouds, 500 feet below clouds, and 2,000 feet horizontally from clouds. And since none of the Class C or D go above 10,000 feet, that's all you need to worry about for those airspaces. And then finally, on the bottom, we have Class Bravo. So inside of the Class Bravo, you are required only to have 3 statute miles of visibility, and you're required to remain clear of clouds. So it's pretty simple for that. All right. Now, hopefully this slide will make it easier. If not, then forget it, but whatever. This is how I remember them. So yeah. So for Class E and Class G above 10,000 feet, you could remember them as 5 F111s. Obviously, the 5 is standing for the 5 statute miles of visibility. And then you have 3 ones, so 1,000 feet above, 1,000 feet below, and a mile visibility. And then below that, you have 3 152s. So 3 152s are 3 statute miles of visibility, 1,000 feet above, 500 feet below, and 2,000 horizontally. And then Class G and Class B, you just have to remember, is 1 statute mile clear of clouds and 3 statute mile clear of clouds, respectively. So hopefully that kind of mnemonic makes sense and helps you remember these. I guarantee you'd probably get asked a question like this on a test or one of the the practical or the written test about what the visibility requirements are in airspace. So there's a caveat, as there are with a lot of things. This caveat is FAR 91-157. So this regulation in particular talks about what's known as special VFR. Special VFR allows you to go below those minimums that we just talked about in controlled airspace. So you can't pull a special VFR in non-controlled airspace because, I mean, in Class G in particular, you're already at this, so it doesn't really matter. However, in controlled airspace, like Class C, let's say you flew into Class C and then all of a sudden the great sunny skies turn into a snow squall, and all of a sudden, the visibility drops 2 miles or something like that. Then you can use what's known as special VFR. So the first thing is you have to have ATC clearance in order to pull special VFR. So you call up the controller and you'd say, hey, I'd like to request special VFR. And then they'd either allow it or they wouldn't allow it. You have to be clear of clouds and you have to have a statute mile of visibility. So basically when you pull special VFR, it reverts to kind of like Class G during the day rules. So you have to have that statute mile visibility. You have to be clear of clouds, and that's it, which isn't a lot. Flying in the statute mile visibility is nothing. It like some runways are longer than a mile. So yeah, that's very low visibility and should be used really only in extreme circumstances. And you can only do this during the day. So between sunrise and sunset, unless, here's another caveat, the pilot of that aircraft has to be IFR rated and the aircraft has to be IFR capable. And then you can fly special VFR at night. However, if you're IFR rated and your plane's IFR rated, I'm not sure why you wouldn't just file IFR anyway, but that is the case. And so, yeah, so special VFR again, it's probably one of those things that you'll be asked a question about. Something probably maybe not on the written, but probably on the practical. I got asked a question on the practical about special VFR, and it basically was phrased in a way like you're flying your class Bravo airspace, and all of a sudden, or you're inside class Bravo airspace, and all of a sudden visibility starts to drop below 3 miles. What can you do? And so the obvious answer is to ask for special VFR clearance from the controller so that you can fly legally. All right, FAR 91-159. When operating at cruise during VFR flight above 3,000 feet of the surface and below 18,000 feet mean sea level, unless otherwise authorized, you must maintain a flight level of, on a magnetic course of between 0 degrees and 179 degrees, an odd 1,000-foot mean sea level altitude plus 500 feet, and then on a magnetic course of 180 degrees to 359 degrees, an even 1,000-foot MSL altitude plus 500 feet. So the big takeaway here, to kind of simplify this down, between 3,000 feet and 18,000 feet, if you're heading east, you have to have an odd 1,000-foot altitude plus 500 feet. And if you're going west, you have to have an even plus 500-foot altitude. This is basically just to keep aircraft that are heading in different directions separated by 1,000 feet so that you don't wind up running into each other inadvertently. IFR traffic is separated by controllers and stuff. They also have regulations, actually. So an IFR cruising flight, you are separated at the even without the 500 added. So for IFR flight, actually, you'd travel at odd 1,000-foot going east and even 1,000-foot going west. So this keeps 500-foot separation between IFR traffic and VFR traffic as well. And so this kind of puts everybody in their own little space so that they don't wind up running into each other. And as long as everybody follows these rules, hopefully nothing happens. The worst case would be obviously you coming up to somebody in front of you and then you overtaking them, but that's far less dangerous than you going at an airplane head on. So on an odd 1,000-foot MSL altitude, or excuse me, on an odd heading, so 0 degrees, the struggle is real. All right. So if you're on an eastward heading from 0 to 179 degrees, you are required to be on an odd 1,000-foot mean sea level altitude plus 500 feet. So this would be like 3,500 feet, 5,500 feet, etc. And on a westerly heading, 180 to 359 degrees, you're required to be on an even 1,000-foot mean sea level altitude plus 500 feet. So 4,500, 6,500, and 8,500, or whatever. Between 3,000 feet and 18,000 feet. So hopefully that makes sense. You'll probably see a question on the written exam about this in some way. They'll probably give you a heading and they'll ask you to give you the correct altitude to be on if you're going that heading. And it probably won't be an easy heading. It'll probably be something, one of the edge cases. So it'll probably be like 0 or 179 or something like that. And they'll try and get you on those. So they also might phrase it as, we haven't really talked about this. This is more of like a charts thing, but there's different types of headings. So in this case, it is magnetic heading, not true course or true heading. So this is what you'd read on a compass versus different types of where the poles are. So like the magnetic pole versus some of their types of poles on the Earth. So magnetic heading. Hopefully that makes sense. FAR 91-203. Except as provided in 91-715, no person may operate a civil aircraft unless it has within it the following: a current airworthiness certificate, a registration certificate, and both must be displayed at the cabin or cockpit entrance so that it is legible to the passengers or crew. So this one's pretty straightforward. When you're flying, on board an aircraft, that aircraft is required to have an airworthiness certificate and a registration certificate. And they have to be somewhere, I think the exact wording is something like they have to be in a obvious, or they use a different word, but anyway, they have to be somewhere that's easy to find. They have to be easily accessible so that people can see and know that those are there and exist. All right. This is another big one that will come up a lot. So FAR 91205. And again, don't necessarily try and just memorize this straight up. There actually is a mnemonic for this, and we'll talk about that next. But just to go over this, so VFR, day flight, this is a list of the required instruments that you're required to have operable before you go flying. So you're required to have an airspeed indicator, an altimeter, a magnetic direction indicator, a tachometer for each engine, oil pressure gauge for each engine using pressure system, temperature gauge for each liquid-cooled engine, an oil temperature gauge for each air-cooled engine, manifold pressure gauge for each altitude engine, fuel gauge indicating the quantity of fuel in each tank, landing gear position indicator if the aircraft has retractable landing gear, red or white anti-collision lights if your aircraft is manufactured after March 11th, 1996, an approved safety belt or other approved restraint device for each occupant 2 years or older, a shoulder harness for the front seat if your aircraft is manufactured after July 18th, 1978, or a shoulder harness for each seat if your aircraft is manufactured after December 12th, 1986, and an ELT if required by 91207. So some of these are not on every aircraft. So some aircraft, for instance, don't have a manifold pressure gauge because a manifold pressure gauge is only useful in an aircraft that has a constant speed propeller, which we haven't really talked about the different types of propellers or aircraft types. But basically what that means is that the propeller blade can switch or has variable pitch. So it can rotate and can give you the best capability for the altitude you're at and the best performance settings in comparison to a fixed pitch prop, which has a certain curve to it. So a Cessna 172, for instance, is not going to have a constant speed propeller, and so it wouldn't have a manifold pressure gauge. Likewise, a Cessna 172 does not have a liquid-cooled engine. It's an air-cooled engine, and so it doesn't have a temperature gauge for those engines. But for the most part, aircraft are going to have an airspeed indicator, altimeter, magnetic direction indicator, a compass, a tachometer, fuel gauge, and anti-collision lights and safety belts. Probably an ELT as well. So you at least need those. However, there is a fun acronym which you can use to remember these. That is ATOMATOFLAMES. Now, even with this, it's still a lot of things to remember. And if you get asked a question, I'm guessing, now, don't quote me on this or anything, but if you get asked a question about this, it's probably going to be one of the easier ones. So it's probably going to be like, it might be worded something like, you got in the aircraft today during your pre-flight and you noticed that the magnetic compass was broken and there was liquid all over the dash. Can you go flying? And the answer is no, you cannot go flying because the magnetic direction indicator is a requirement of FAR 91205. Likewise, it might be something about the airspeed indicator or one of the easier ones. So don't think that you have to know all of these. And in fact, when you get to the point where you go and you take your actual FAA practical exam, where you sit down in front of the examiner, or the oral exam rather, and he asks you questions, you'll also be able to reference the FAR if you need it. So you can say, I don't know the answer to that. However, I know that it's an FAR 91205. So I think we were kind of talking about this last time about whether or not you need to know the numbers. This is one of the ones where it's helpful to know the numbers of the FAR. So if this is one of the numbers that you remember, Remember, FAR 91205 is VFR day instrument requirements. So yeah, ATOMATOFLAMES, a nice little acronym. Likewise, there's also requirements for night. So during night VFR flight, you are required, in addition to ATOMATOFLAMES, you're required to have position lights, landing lights, if you're flying for hire, red or white anti-collision lights if your aircraft was manufactured after August 11th, 1971, an adequate source of electrical energy for all installed electrical and radio equipment, that'd be like an alternator, one spare set of fuses, or 3 spare fuses of each kind required that are accessible to the pilot in flight. If you have circuit breakers, you do not need to worry about the fuse thing. The fuses are kind of an older style thing now. Most aircraft have circuit breakers, so you won't see that very often. But so, like ATOMATOFLAMES for VFR day, this also has a fun little whatever these are called. Anyway, so flaps. Fuses, landing light, anti-collision light, position lights, source of electricity, in addition to ATOMATOFLAMES. So this one's a little bit easier to remember, but just know that if you're flying VFR at night, you're also required to have these things, except maybe the fuses, but still required if you have them. All right. So this is kind of an addition onto the last one because we talked about the ELT. So VFR day, you're required to have an ELT as long as it's required by FAR 91207 or in concordance with FAR 91207. So you have to have an ELT equipped. And if that ELT, there are 2 different types of ELTs. There's ones with rechargeable and non-rechargeable batteries. And maybe I should also go over what an ELT is. So an ELT is an emergency locator transmitter. So basically this thing is a box inside your aircraft. And in the case of an emergency where you have to ditch the aircraft and it hits the ground, the ELT has a sensor inside of it, and if you exceed the sensor, whatever it's set at, it will go off. And the ELT broadcasts a sound on the frequency 121.5, which is the emergency frequency. And this ELT can be picked up by search and rescue people. So like the Civil Air Patrol, they can go out and they can find ELTs. Also, most regional and commercial airlines all monitor 121.5, and all towers monitor 121.5, and all centers also monitor 121.5. So if they hear this thing going off on 121.5, it means that someone's had an ELT go off for whatever reason. Now it is possible that ELTs can go off just sitting on the ground. It's pretty rare. Usually it's after they land really hard and they go park their aircraft and they go off. I've heard of stories like that. But anyway, so that's kind of a little bit of background on what an ELT is. So there's 2 types, rechargeable and non-rechargeable. So this requirement is about when you have to replace the ELT or the ELTs or batteries. So when you use the ELT or when the ELT has been used for more than 1 cumulative hour, you must replace or recharge it. And when 50% of the useful life or 50% of the charge life has expired, you are, or whatever is established by the transmitter manufacturer, you're required to replace or recharge those batteries. So an ELT, if it get like, let's say, sitting in your hangar going off for an hour because you had a rough landing. Now, I don't know how you know that, but for whatever reason you knew that was longer than an hour, you're required to replace or recharge the batteries. And if 50% of its life has expired, or 50% of its charge life has expired, you're required to recharge or replace the ELT. FAR 91209. During sunset to sunrise, an aircraft must have position lights on, and when parked or when parking or moving an aircraft or in or in dangerous proximity to a night flight or night flight operations area of an airport, the aircraft must be illuminated and have position lights on or be in an area that is marked by obstruction lights. You must have anti-collision lights on unless the pilot in command deems it necessary to turn them off in the interest of safety. So basically, this is talking about light requirements at night. So you have to have position lights on at all times during the night. And you have to have some sort of either position lights or you have to have like be in a highly lit area when you're moving the aircraft on the ground at night. So at a lot of like non-controlled airports, they don't have a lot of lighting. So when you're moving around on the ground at night, you're required to have your position lights on, or have some sort of illumination in conjunction with that. And you must always have your anti-collision lights on. These are like the strobe lights that you see going off on aircraft on the sides. You must have those on unless, for some reason, it causes a safety hazard. So if you're flying in extreme IFR conditions, or low visibility conditions, let's say maybe it's even VFR outside, so 3 statute mile visibility, but it's snowing at night, having your anti-collision lights on and those going off can be very disorienting when it's snowing, because it lights up the snow and then the snow goes away, and it can be kind of disorienting. So in that case, you could turn them off if need be. So yeah, position lights, anti-collision lights, and then when you're moving on the ground, you have to have your position lights on at least, unless you're in a highly lit area. FAR 91211. No person may operate an aircraft without supplemental oxygen above 12,500 feet mean sea level, up to and including 14,000 feet mean sea level, unless the flight crew is provided and uses supplemental oxygen after 30 minutes of flight at that altitude. Above 14,000 feet mean sea level, unless the flight crew is provided with and uses supplemental oxygen for the duration of the flight at that altitude. Above 15,000 feet mean sea level, unless each occupant of the aircraft is provided with supplemental oxygen. So basics, what you need to remember: between 12,500 feet and 14,000 feet, the crew after 30 minutes of flight is required to have supplemental oxygen. Above 14,000 feet to 15,000 feet, the flight crew must have supplemental oxygen on at all times. And above 15,000 feet, everybody on board the aircraft must have supplemental oxygen. There's a caveat to this, in which case the aircraft is pressurized. Then obviously you don't need to have supplemental oxygen. This is just in the case that your aircraft is not pressurized. Now, there is one thing I should say here. It's not necessarily explicit here, but at night, the FAA has put out guidance that you can get like hypoxia and other oxygen deficiency related problems way lower than these numbers. So even during the day, you could too. But like, you can get hypoxia really low at night. Like, you could get it like 8,000 feet or even lower, depending on the conditions. So even though this is the regulations, you have to know what your limits are. And if you start feeling hypoxic or other things like that, then you need to get down closer to the ground. So even though there's regulations, this doesn't mean it's the end all be all, but just know that that's also out there. But basics, what you'll be tested on is this stuff right here. FAR 91215. You must have a Mode C transponder equipped and operable when in Class A. Class B, you're within a 30-mile class or Mode C veil of a Class B. Class C, above a Class B or a Class C, up to 10,000 feet mean sea level, or Class E, at or above 10,000 feet mean sea level, excluding airspace, at or below 2,500 feet above the surface. Okay, so we kind of talked about requirements for entering controlled airspace before. I think last time we talked about that. And Mode C transponder was one of those requirements. So to enter into Class C, Class B, you're required to have a Mode C transponder. And transponder basically, when it gets hit with the radar signal, will respond to the radar signal with a code. And that code and some other stuff, some position stuff, gets sent back to the radar, and then that shows up on the radar scope in the tower or wherever that radar facility is. In conjunction with requiring Mode C transponder within Class B and Class C, you're also required to have one when you're in Class A. You're required to have one when you're within a 30-mile, what they call a Mode C veil. And we didn't talk about this last time, but if you look on a sectional chart map around a Class Bravo airport, some of them have what's called a Mode C veil, and it's a solid magenta line that's 30 miles away from the airport. And inside of that Mode C veil, you're required to have a Mode C transponder. So even though you're not inside the Class Bravo, it's likely that you'll be communicating with them at that point. And so you're required to have a transponder equipped in your aircraft. Also, in conjunction to that, you're also required to have a Mode C transponder if you're above a Class Bravo or Class Charlie airspace up to 10,000 feet. So even though you're not inside the airspace, you're still above them, and they still, that you might probably be talking to them if you're above them, getting like flight following or something. And so you're required to have a Mode C transponder if you're above either of those two airspaces. Now, oftentimes the Class Bravo airspace will extend up to 10,000 feet, but in case that it doesn't, you're required to have that. And Class E airspace above 10,000 feet and below. So this is kind of a weirdly phrased part of it, but basically what it's saying is if Class E for some reason is below 2,500 feet above the surface, so let's say the surface is really high up, like I don't know, a mountainous region, and that mountainous region extends into the 10,000 feet mean sea level, which is based on pressure, you're not required to have it from 2,500 feet from the surface up to 2,500 feet. But then above that, you're required to have Mode C transponder. So basically, I guess what all this to say is controlled airspace, except for Class C below 10,000 feet, you're required to have a Mode C transponder, and Class Delta airspace as well. You're not required in Class Delta, but hopefully that makes sense. FAR 91303. No person may operate an aircraft in aerobatic flight over any congested area of a city, town, or settlement, over an open area air assembly of persons, within the lateral boundaries of the surface areas of Class B, C, D, or E airspace designated for an airport, within 4 nautical miles of the center line of any federal airway, below an altitude of 1,500 feet above the surface, or when flight visibility is less than 3 statute miles. In this section, it refers, that is, aerobatic flight refers to any intentional maneuver that involves abrupt change to attitude or abnormal acceleration. So we're talking about another regulation next, which kind of ties into this, but you cannot perform aerobatic maneuvers over people that are not covered. You cannot perform aerobatic maneuvers within controlled airspace, and you cannot perform aerobatic maneuvers when you're within a federal airway, which we didn't talk about those yet. Just know that for now. And when you're below 1,500 feet, this is kind of a gimme, like if you're that low to the ground and something goes wrong, you're obviously not going to be able to recover. And obviously, again, if the visibility is really low, you you shouldn't be doing this because you probably won't be able to recover if something goes wrong. And you're not allowed to do them over cities or towns or whatever. So you might be asking, well, when can you do aerobatic maneuvers? Well, the answer is they have what's called designated aerobatic boxes. So aerobatic boxes can be set up at certain airports, and then you can go into those aerobatic boxes and you can fly aerobatic maneuvers. Alternatively, you could also do this in like Class G airspace, that's above 1,500 feet, or Class E airspace, that is not around, people or towns or anything like that, and it's not an airport. So, also TFRs, if you're at an air show or something, a TFR might be put in place, and then they'll have an aerobatic box there. So yeah, aerobatic flight. So the next regulation is kind of similar, but this is talking about parachutes. So during aerobatic flight, obviously, you'd have a parachute on. This kind of gives you a definition of aerobatic flight, kind of, but it's not the same as the last one. This last one has a looser definition. This is a stricter definition. But anyway, no pilot of a civil aircraft may allow a parachute that is available for emergency use to be carried in that aircraft unless it is an approved type and has been packed by a certified and appropriately rated parachute rigger within the past 180 days if it's made of nylon, rayon, or other synthetics, within the past 60 days if it's made of silk, pongee, or natural materials. Unless all occupants are wearing an approved parachute, no pilot of a civil aircraft carrying another person other than a crew member may intentionally exceed a bank of 60 degrees relative to the horizon, or a nose up or nose down attitude of 30 degrees relative to the horizon. So this kind of is more for if you're doing aerobatic maneuvers. This kind of gives a stricter definition. So the definition here is you have to, if you're exceeding a bank of 60 degrees, or if you're pitching the nose up or down 30 degrees, then you're required to have a parachute on board. And that parachute on board must be rigged by an approved parachute rigger, and it has to be packed within the last 180 days if it's synthetic and 60 days if it's natural materials. All right, FAR 91309. No person may operate a civil aircraft towing a glider or unpowered ultralight vehicle unless the pilot has met requirements of 6169. The towing aircraft is equipped with a tow hitch installed and approved by the administrator. The tow line has a braking strength of more than 80% of the max certified operating weight of the glider, ultralight, and not more than twice the weight unless there is a safety link. If operating in controlled airspace, the pilot in command notifies either ATC or a flight service station. The pilots have agreed on a general course of action and emergency procedures. No pilot may release a tow line after release of a glider that endangers the life or property of another. So we talked about requirements for towing gliders before, when we were way back, when we were talking about 6169, and this is in addition to that. So in order to tow a glider, there are certain requirements of the tow rope and the tow hitch. So the tow hitch has to be approved to be able to use that. And the tow line, now these numbers I know are kind of like obscure and hard to remember. However, it may be the case that you get asked a question about that. I vaguely remember getting asked a question about tow lines somewhere. So this is just one of those oddball things that you might get asked on. Not that you need to know it, because if you get one question wrong here and there, it's not a big deal. But anyway, so the tow line has to have a braking strength of more than 80% of the maximum weight of whatever is being towed. And it can't be more than twice the weight unless there's a safety link. So if there's a safety link, then you can exceed up to twice the weight. Otherwise, it's only up to 80%. And you cannot tow a glider if you're in controlled airspace unless you've contacted ATC and figured that out. and both the pilot towing and the glider pilot have to know what's happening and what's going to go on, so there's no accidents related to that. And after the pilot releases the glider, that tow line is still attached to the aircraft. And so that pilot can't just release that tow line over a house or something like that's dangerous. So they have to make sure that you're releasing it at a safe point where you wouldn't injure somebody with that. Again, this is one of those more obscure rules, but you may or may not see something on this. So for whatever
For
it's
that
worth.
tow line, sorry, I don't mean to interrupt.
No,
but,
yeah, go ahead.
For that tow line, does it pose a hazard to land with that attached still?
Like attach the aircraft, like tow it back to land.
Right.
Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
So I mean, I guess it could be the case that you're towing it back in, and for some reason, when you're landing, it gets caught on something. That could be the case. And there could be other cases where it's more dangerous. However, I think I'm not too familiar with like flying gliders and stuff, so I'm not sure what the actual
Okay.
what you'd actually do. But I think you could drop it over when you're staging gliders, you have a place that you're staging them, and so you probably would just drop it there. Yeah, I'm not sure if they actually land with them or not. I'm not too sure on that. I've never done glider flying. Wish I
Okay.
have, but haven't. Hopefully, yeah. I don't know. I have to look into that.
Thanks.
Yeah, no problem. All right. FAR 91-313. No person may operate a restricted category civil aircraft for other than the special purpose for which it is certified, or in an operation other than one necessary to accomplish the work activity directly associated with that special purpose operation. Flight crew member training, proficiency checks, or relocation of the aircraft. Not be operated for compensation or hire, and not carry non-essential crew members, and not operate over densely populated areas or in congested airway or near a busy airport where passenger transport is conducted. So again, this is another kind of obscure rule, talking about restricted category aircraft. So in the case where your aircraft is issued a restricted category, you cannot use it for anything other than what it says you can use it for. And you have to also make sure that you're not carrying like extra passengers, or you're flying for hire. So trying to think of like a good example of what this might be. I'm not sure. There might be some older aircraft or some specific experimental aircraft maybe would be a better option. So maybe some experimental aircraft that are issued this restricted category. So for instance, I don't know, the X-15 or something crazy. That has a specific purpose, and the FAA said you could use it for that specific purpose. And if you exceed that specific purpose, then you're starting to go beyond what the FAA is allowed, and probably you could endanger people and endanger property. So when you're flying an aircraft that has a restricted category, you can only fly it in a way that the FAA has allowed you to. You can't carry extra passengers, and you can't fly for hire, and you can't fly over someplace like a city or an airport where you can hurt people. So it's basically what it's saying. FAR 91-319. No person may operate an aircraft that has an experimental certificate for other than the purpose for which the certificate was issued, or carrying persons or property for compensation or hire. No person may operate an aircraft that has an experimental certificate outside of an area assigned by the administrator until it is shown that the aircraft is controllable throughout its normal range of speeds and throughout all the maneuvers to be executed, and the aircraft has no hazardous operating characteristics or design features. Unless otherwise noted, not operate over a densely populated area or in a congested airway. Each person operating an aircraft that has an experimental certificate shall advise each person carried of the experimental nature of the aircraft and operate under VFR day only unless otherwise specified or otherwise specifically authorized by the administrator, and notify the control tower of the experimental nature of the aircraft when operating the aircraft into or out of airports with operating control towers. So the big takeaway here is, let's say you built like an aircraft. Let's say, I don't know, you built like a Kit Fox or something. That aircraft, since it was not certified by the FAA under normal circumstances, like a Cessna 172 is normally certified, and they give you a certificate. It's not an experimental certificate. It is like these are actually like a certificate issued by the manufacturer of a certified aircraft. I believe it's blue, and experimental certificates are like pink, I think. And so these experimental certificates are issued in the case that someone probably built the aircraft, or it's not a regular certifiable aircraft. It didn't go through rigor of that process. And so in that case, you have to follow certain rules and regulations. So for instance, after you built the aircraft, you have to go through an extensive testing procedure before you're allowed to carry passengers. And that's kind of what Section B is talking about. And you have to make sure it's tested and that, it's not just going to break apart or have some fatal flaw. You can't then fly the aircraft, over busy places or basically anywhere where you can hurt somebody if the aircraft malfunctioned or whatever. And you have to fly during the day, and you have to fly VFR. So no IFR flying or anything like that. And you can't fly out of the bounds of whatever the certificate says. So if the certificate says something in particular, I don't know, you can't fly over water or whatever, I don't know. Can't do that. So yeah, experimental certificates, usually you'll see this in conjunction with the home-built aircraft. However, this applies to any aircraft with an experimental certificate, whatever the case. FAR 91403. The owner or operator of an aircraft is primarily responsible for maintaining that aircraft in an airworthy condition. No person may perform maintenance, preventative maintenance, or alterations of on an aircraft other than as prescribed in the subpart and other applicable regulations. It must comply with the manufacturer's maintenance manual or instructions for continued airworthiness. So likely that you would see a question like this: who is responsible for maintaining the aircraft in an airworthy condition? You'll probably see something like the pilot in command, the owner or operator, or I don't know, something else weird like ATC or something. So the answer is the owner or operator is required to maintain the aircraft in an airworthy condition. Now, the PIC is required to make sure the aircraft is safe for flight, but in general, the owner or operator has to maintain that aircraft in an airworthy condition. And in order to perform maintenance, you have to have certain FAA certifications. Preventative maintenance is something that you can do as a pilot, and there are a list of things you can do, like change your oil, and I think even change tires, and a few other things you can do that you don't need a mechanic for. And you have to make sure that the person who's doing whatever the work is allowed to do that. And you have to obviously comply with any of the manufacturer's recommendations or whatever they have out for your aircraft in order to maintain its airworthiness. So, but big takeaway: owner operator is required to maintain the aircraft in an airworthy condition. FAR 91405. Each owner or operator of an aircraft shall have the aircraft inspected as prescribed in subpart E of this part, and shall be required, between required inspections as provided in paragraph C of this section, have discrepancies repaired as prescribed in part 43 of this chapter. Shall ensure that maintenance personnel make appropriate entries in aircraft maintenance records indicating that aircraft has been approved for return to service, shall have any inoperative instruments or item of equipment permitted to be inoperative by 91.213 of this part, repaired, replaced, removed, or inspected at the next required inspection. And when listed discrepancies include inoperative instruments or equipment, shall ensure that a placard has been installed as required by 4311 of this chapter. So, big picture here. When the aircraft goes in for inspection, the owner operator is required to make sure that the proper entries get made into logbooks. And we'll talk about the logbooks a little bit later. I don't know how many more slides forward it is. We only have a few more slides left. I don't think we'll get through them tonight. And so there's certain logbooks for some, like the power plant has a logbook. And so the owner or operator is required to make sure that the maintenance people who do the work on it make the correct records in that logbook, and make sure that the aircraft has been approved to go back and fly. If for some reason an instrument that is not required and is allowed to be inoperative is inoperative, then you have to placard it to make sure that people know that it's inoperative. And if it's allowed to be inoperative, but it's required to be repaired, or for whatever reason, then you have to make sure that that gets replaced at the next inspection. So, for instance, there are certain instruments that are not required for flight, like, I don't know, a GPS. Now, if that GPS is inaccurate and it's still working, but it's not working correctly, then what you could do is you could placard that and say inoperative. And that way, people who fly that aircraft know that that GPS isn't working. It's not required to have a GPS on board for flight, so you can still go flying. But whenever you go in for your next inspection, if it's one of those things that you need to be inspected, then you just have that GPS inspected at the next inspection. So hopefully that makes sense. FAR 91.407. No person may operate an aircraft that has undergone maintenance, preventative maintenance, rebuilding, or alteration unless it has been approved for return to service by a person authorized under 43.7 of this chapter, and the maintenance record entry required by 43.9 or 43.11 as applicable of this chapter has been made. No person may carry any person other than crew members in an aircraft that has been maintained, rebuilt, or altered in a manner that may have appreciably changed its flight characteristics or substantially affected its operation in flight until appropriately rated pilot, with at least a private pilot certificate, flies that aircraft, makes an operational check of the maintenance performed or alteration made, and logs the flight in the aircraft records. So a lot of words, but in general, whenever that aircraft is done getting whatever happened to it, so if it was maintenance, if it's rebuilding, whatever it is, so whenever that's finished, that pilot, the owner and operator actually has to make sure that all the logbooks are signed correctly, everything's set, and it's able to return to service. And then that airplane has to be flown in order to make sure that whatever change has been made has not affected the flight characteristics in any substantial way. So if you go in and, I don't know, for some reason they rebuilt something, I don't know, they reattached the elevator assembly, so they put new cables in, and they tested on the ground, and they said, all right, she's good to go. Well, before you carry passengers, you have to go up and you have to have at least a private pilot certificate, and you go out and you fly that aircraft to make sure that the elevators are all working correctly and nothing has really changed. And once that happens and you've concluded safely, then you log that on the flight records that you flew that flight and that the aircraft is good to return to service. 91.409. Except as provided in paragraph C of this section, no person may operate an aircraft unless within the preceding 12 calendar months it has had an annual inspection in accordance with Part 43 of this chapter and has been approved for return to service by a person authorized by 43.7 of this chapter, or an inspection for the issuance of an airworthiness certificate in accordance with Part 21 of this chapter. For any aircraft that flies for compensation or hire, or flight instruction for hire, you cannot fly it unless within the preceding 100 hours of time in service, the aircraft has received an annual or 100-hour inspection and been approved for return to service in accordance with Part 43 of this chapter. The 100-hour limitation may be exceeded, but not by not more than 10 hours while en route to reach a place where the inspection can be done. The excess time used to reach a place where the inspection can be done must be included in computing the next 100 hours of time in service. So basically, aircraft are required to have annual and 100-hour inspections. 100 hours barring if you fly it for hire or flight instruction for hire. So in the case that you just fly your plane normally or whatever, you're required to have an annual inspection done on that aircraft. That annual inspection has to be done by a special mechanic who is authorized to perform the annual inspection. And then that mechanic will return it to service after checking everything over. It's a pretty intensive process. They check a lot of different things, and then they'll return it to service if it's good to go. If not, they'll make repairs, and then they'll return it to service or whatever. You get an airworthiness certificate issued to you, then that also counts towards that. So every year, you're required to have that annual inspection done. Now, the caveat to that is if that aircraft is used for compensation or hire or flight instruction for hire. If that's the case, then the aircraft needs to have a 100-hour inspection, which means it's inspected every 100 hours. And during that 100-hour, you have to either have an annual or a 100-hour inspection, and then it's returned to service. So our flight school that I went to, every 100 hours, we'd go down and we'd get an annual done on the aircraft. You could just get away with a 100-hour and do an annual every year. But in our case, we just did the annual every 100 hours. We never had to worry about doing an annual inspection. Kind of worked out very nicely. So yeah, the 100-hour limitation here has another caveat, which is that you can fly it for more than 10 hours past that. So you could fly it to 110 hours as long as that time is used to get to the place where you do mechanic work. So if your 100 hours coming up and you're at 95 hours, you know it's going to take you 6 hours to get to the place where your mechanic is, then it's legal to do that. So you can fly over that 100 hours as long as you're taking it to that inspection place. Then you have to calculate that into the next 100 hours because you went over the 100 hours, and so they'll do all that math for you. But anyway, so those are the regulations regarding annual inspections and 100-hour inspections. All right, pretty close to 8 o'clock here. Does anyone have any questions about anything we covered? Kind of covered a lot of different things.
So with 100-hour inspections, those apply to like big jets as well, but those can fly like 12 hours in a single flight. Are they getting inspected like once every couple of weeks?
Yeah, so I mean, those big jets, now there are different parts of the FARs which are for commercial operations, but yeah, I mean they get inspected quite frequently, a lot more frequently than you might think. Yeah. Yeah, so this applies to any aircraft, unless for some reason they're not required to have that. I'm not sure why, but yeah, I mean, yeah, jets used in charter operations, jets used in any of those applications for hire. Yeah, 100-hour inspections. Any other questions?